This week's presentation is Fascinating Stories Behind Mexican Street Names, presented by David Ellison. Now, David Ellison has long had a debt to pay to Los Niños Héroes, the martyred young cadets who defended Chapultepec Castle in 1847 during the US invasion. A gifted raconteur, Ellison will explain his debt and how he will pay it with his forthcoming book that introduces expats to Mexican history. He will regale the audience with captivating stories from the book in progress about some of Mexico's inspiring heroes and colorful scoundrels, including the rest of the story that never makes the textbooks. This is history and her story like you've never heard it before. Please give a warm welcome to David Ellison.
Good morning, everybody. It's so fun to be here with you all and see your, or not see your faces. And thank you to the board and to Margaret Von Avery is over here. I know she's a longstanding supporter and director of the Open Circle Talk, so I owe you all a great debt. You need to know before I begin that travel is a huge theme in my life. Right after college, I lost my mind and I went to Spain for nearly 2 years. And it changed my life. It's where I learned to speak Spanish. It's where I immersed myself in a foreign culture and learned that the American way wasn't the only way, or even necessarily the best way. It's where I began my teaching career, 36 years. So it was really a monumental time in my life. And it was also the beginning of, well, some of the most embarrassing moments of my life, one of which led me here to talk to you today. So I'll begin with a few of my most embarrassing moments. One, I was teaching English at an after-hours sort of Berlitz-like school called En Lingua. And one afternoon, I should say, there English was forbidden in the class. Spanish was forbidden in the classroom, which worked really well for me when I began because I spoke no Spanish. I said, cool. But later, as I began to learn it, I got a little bit frustrated because and as I got a little cocky with my knowledge of Spanish, sometimes I would toss off a quick explanation in Spanish and save time. And so I had this afternoon class with a bunch of high school kids, 15 of them or so. And whatever we were reading, the expression, the last straw came up. And I didn't want to get into a long, they asked, what is that? And I didn't want to get into a long discussion about camels. So I just flippantly tossed off my Spanish, la última paja. And mayhem, chaos in the room. They were pounding their desks. And I, what the heck? And I went out into the sort of the foyer area where the secretaries were, and I said, I just said la última paja, and then they're like, oh, don David, oh, and well, I got home that night. Paja is the, or at least was, the teenage colloquial expression for male masturbation. The last jack-off. Now, not too long after that, they have a custom in Spain that in the afternoons, everyone, they don't go home and watch TV, they all go outside and they go for a walk and they meet each other, they greet each other. And one of their favorite pastimes is to go bar hopping. And they don't get drunk, very dissimilar to the United States. In fact, what they usually order is something called una caña, which is just a little shot of beer. And you get a pincho as well, which is a little piece of bread and maybe some chorizo, some sausage. And you just go from 3 or 4 bars, meeting all your friends, having a grand old time, and then you head home, and maybe you've had, all told, I don't know, a beer and a half, because the cañas are pretty small. And well, one day I was feeling my oats. My Spanish is improving. I had my 4 Spanish friends behind me. I said, let me order. So I walked into the bar and I said, 5 coños, por favor. And the bartender just looked at me, blinked. And I said, 5 coños, vámonos, marchando. Coño, caña, it's an easy mistake. Coño is the Spanish equivalent of the C word for vagina in Spanish. 5 of them. Come on, let's go. And right now, my partner in the audience is saying, I don't know that man. I don't know that man. Anyways, the third embarrassing moment is the reason I'm here, and this one is not funny. It was 1984, and I was already a teacher in Texas, of all places, but during the summer, I came to Mexico for the first time. I was in Mexico City, and I went to see Chapultepec Park, which is their equivalent of sort of Central Park. It's beautiful. And Chapultepec is a Nahuatl or Aztec word for grasshopper. So it's Grasshopper Park, and in the middle of the park is Grasshopper Hill, Chapultepec Hill, upon which is a castle. And at the base is this monument with 6 marble pillars towering to the sky. And I just said, that looks interesting. And I went over and read the inscription, and it said in Spanish, this monument is dedicated to the 6 young cadets that here gave their lives defending their nation from the invader. And I looked up and went, you know, people from all over the world around me. And I said, who is the invader? And they just looked at me in horror and disgust and walked away, shaking their heads. And I said, whoops, I guess I stepped in something. And this is before the age of cell phones, so I thought, I think I've got some homework to do when I get home. And I forgot to turn on my timer. Uh-oh. Well, anyways. I went home and learned the story, and in 1846, the United States was in the midst of Manifest Destiny, which was the belief that the United States would, and in fact should, extend all the way to the Pacific. And our president at the time, President Polk, vowed he would fulfill Manifest Destiny. And so he contacted the then president/dictator of Mexico, Santa Anna, and said, I'd like to buy half your country, please. And for some strange reason, he said no. And Polk said, I wasn't really asking. And at the time, tensions were high because Mexico had just lost the war with Texas, and Santa Anna and the Mexicans were not happy about losing Texas. And there was a border dispute between the United States and Mexico. Where would the border be drawn? The Mexicans wanted the northern border at the Nueces River. We wanted the southern border at the Rio Grande. And tensions were high. So the American forces marched to the northern border of the Nueces River, and the Mexican forces marched to the southern border of the Rio Grande, and there was sort of a no man's land in between. And Polk just told his general, cross the Nueces River and walk and, sort of look like you're going to attack, but don't fire. I need the Mexicans to fire first, which, when they see the Americans menacingly approaching, they defended themselves. They opened fire, and, so began the Mexican-American War. Now, of course, if it had really been about the border, our troops would have stopped at the border. This war is over. We've secured the border. We're done. But instead, we invaded the country on 3 different fronts and marched all the way to Mexico City. And by the way, even Abraham Lincoln, who was a junior member of the House of Representatives at the time, said, this is a trumped-up war. To which I'm sure Polk said, duh. But anyways, we marched all the way to Mexico City, and the city's last holdout was this castle on top of Chapultepec Hill. And it was a cadet academy, young cadets. And these kids fought tenaciously, bravely, and futilely. And it was a horrible battle. I mean, it was just really violent and massive death on both sides. And finally, the commander just told the cadets, stand down. It's over. We've lost. And 6 of the young kids, just overwhelmed with patriotic despair, couldn't do it. And they fought to the death. One of them, Francisco Marquez, he was 13 years old. And Juan Escutia, according to legend, in order to prevent the American flag from falling, the Mexican flag from falling into the American hands, he wrapped himself in the flag and threw himself off the parapet to his death. And I had said, who are the invaders? I mean, and I was a college-educated teacher at the time. I mean, just what embarrassing ignorance, and inexcusable ignorance. Now, a few years later, I was in Mexico again, and I'm a former Catholic, so I still believe in ritual. And I made the pilgrimage back to that monument, and I stood before those 6 kids, and I said, I am so sorry for my ignorance and for my country. And I vowed for the rest of my career, it's not covered in the textbooks, but my students will know your story, they will know your sacrifice. And for the next 30 years, I fulfilled that pledge every single year. Well, then I retire to Mexico, here in Ajijic, and I walk through the streets and see all these street signs, Zaragoza, Matamoros, and who the heck are they? And I just realized, wait a minute, if this is my home, how dare me walk through these streets and remain ignorant? Have I really fulfilled my pledge to those kids? And the answer is no, I haven't. It's an inexcusable ignorance. And so I'm writing a book on Mexican history, actually the story behind Mexican street names for my fellow expats and for visitors and tourists everywhere. And so I'm going to give you a little preview about what I'm discovering as I go. And I have to say, it's fun, it's fascinating. I've got some great stories to tell you about these people. Mexican history is particularly colorful. Just a word of disclaimer, I don't have a degree in history. I'm not an expert on Mexican history. I did teach history. I'm just a retired teacher who loves history, and I'm studying it and learning, and so I'm probably making lots of mistakes along the way. So please excuse that. So where shall I begin? Let's begin where we should begin, with God. I'm speaking about Quetzalcoatl, of course. All right. Quetzalcoatl was one of the, perhaps for a long time, the chief gods of most of the Native American communities, including the Olmecs, the Teotihuacan, the Mayans, the Toltecs, and the Aztecs. And he's depicted as a plumed snake, and he was at various times the god of water, wind, air, learning, knowledge, the dawn, merchants, the arts, and the priesthood. And he's even credited with creating the human race, sort of the Native American Prometheus. And just as the Romans stole from the Greeks, all these succeeding Native American communities stole from each other. So Quetzalcoatl remained a huge god in all their different cultures. And there's a huge pyramid outside Cholula near Puebla. It's not the tallest, but it is the most massive pyramid in the Americas. And it's dedicated to Quetzalcoatl. So this is a big god. And we get to the Toltecs, which is a theocracy, so the rulers were also the priests, and they worshipped above all Quetzalcoatl, which I need to add, didn't demand human sacrifice. But the Toltecs were invaded by another group who believed in a god that did demand human sacrifice. And what's interesting is one of the chief priests had been so dedicated and so amazing as a youth that they had, the priests got together and they gave him the honorific name of Quetzalcoatl. So at this point, sort of the story of the god Quetzalcoatl and the king Quetzalcoatl get really mushed together, and you can't tell the difference. And what happened is both the king and the god lost the war, and the priests to Quetzalcoatl were expelled. And what's the bad news about that is, of course, that then human sacrifice reigned supreme. And so there are real consequences to that loss. And so when the Aztecs took over, they inherited that culture, and that with just horrific consequences. And but interestingly enough, the Aztecs did not believe in a linear sort of history that we do. One thing follows the next. They believed in cyclical history. And so they fully expected that Quetzalcoatl would come around again. And which for years has explained why was Cortés, with just a few hundred soldiers, able to bring down the mightiest empire. And the explanation is, well, Montezuma figured, oh, this is Quetzalcoatl returned, and so they opened up the gates and they let Quetzalcoatl in. They let Cortez in. Cortez sort of just kidnapped Montezuma and used him as hostage. And there's only one problem, and this is, how many remember hearing that story as a kid? This is why the Aztecs lost. But modern historians don't believe it. They believe that was just a story created by Cortez. And then I said, okay, then how did Montezuma lose to these Spaniards? And alas, there doesn't seem to be an explanation. It's a mystery. So we've got this great story, which historians discount, but they haven't offered any explanation. Why Montezuma was no idiot. Why did he behave the way he did? And I don't know. Let's go on to another great Native American prince, king, priest. And his name is tough to say, so I'll say it slowly, and then I want you all to say it again. It's Nezahualcóyotl. Now I said that wrong. Nezahualcóyotl. Say that? One more time. Nezahualcóyotl. Okay, now say it 10 times fast. No, he was the heir apparent in Texcoco, which is a city on this lake by the same name, which is where Tenochtitlan was located, which became Mexico City. But his kingdom was invaded. He witnessed the death of his father. He fled, lived in exile, and of course the invaders tried to track him down. And Nezahualcóyotl must have been beloved, because twice people who looked like him volunteered to stand in his place and be executed so that he could remain alive. And he ended up putting together a coalition of 100,000 troops, reinvaded Texcoco, claimed the throne for his own. And then he became sort of the quintessential philosopher king. He made of Texcoco what many historians have called the Athens of the modern world. He surrounded himself with poets and philosophers and scientists and mathematicians, but most people believe of all of those, he was by far the greatest. And another thing, in the midst of all this human sacrifice, he alone began to believe in monotheism, one God. And he created a temple to this God, which was empty. All it had in it was just air. And the only way he worshiped this God was with incense and fasting. And he believed in, freedom of religion, so he didn't force anyone to believe that, but he just tried to convert people by his example. And his poetry survives. And I just want to read some of this poetry, which is over 600 years old, by the great philosopher king Nezahualcóyotl of Texcoco. And I'll read each of them twice, because poetry needs to be savored. The first one says, I love the song of the mockingbird, bird of 400 voices. I love the color of jade and the enervating scent of the flowers. But I love most my brother man. In the interest of time, I'll fly through them. Anyways, this one. Dance and celebrate the mighty God. Let us enjoy this glory, because human life is fleeting. And finally, perhaps in vain we come to live, to sprout on the earth. Let's at least leave flowers. Let's at least leave song. I would have liked to have met Nezahualcóyotl. He's currently on, I believe, the 100 peso note. So, anyways, no cheating. So everyone remain silent. The main street here is Colón. How many know who Colón was? Just a few of you. Actually, all of you do. Colón is Cristobal Colón, Christopher Columbus. So that's the main street here, named after him. And it might be interesting, you know why he came, looking for the fast way to India. the silks and spices. Do you know why they wanted silks and spices? I digress, but I love this story. Anybody know? Yeah, at the time in the Middle Ages, the Catholics, everyone was Catholic at that time, did not believe in bathing. Because in order to bathe, you had to take off your clothes, and that is sexual. And so they did not bathe, nor did they change their clothes. So imagine that what you're wearing today, you have to wear to bed and wear every day for the next 3 or 4 months without bathing. And so they showered themselves with perfume to try to cover the stench. And but during the, and no, another problem they had was food. I mean, you kill the cow, all right, you grill it, tastes really good, but no refrigeration. So you pound salt into it. Yet you can't waste it. You know, everyone's on the verge of starvation, so you pound salt, and after 3 weeks, can you imagine eating that for dinner? Eating was not a pleasant affair. Well, they fought this horrible series of wars called the Crusades. Stupid, and the Christians lost. But one thing that they learned about were the silks and spices of the Far East. And silk is something that keeps you warm in the winter, cool in the summer, does not absorb odors, is always comfortable. How much would you pay for that? And the spices of the East take that rancid beef and mix it with curry, and suddenly dinner tastes good. And it also kills germs. How much would you pay for that? Now, really, the only way to get there was to do it the Marco Polo way, which was not very efficient. But if we could send a ship and fill it with tons of this stuff, the wealth would be unimaginable, the stuff of empires. Now, Christopher Columbus, I believe, is really misunderstood, because everyone says, well, he alone knew that the world was flat. That's ridiculous. I don't know how that story started. That wasn't on the table of discussion. What he did argue, however, was that the world was small. And he argued, here's the trouble, there was, if you go off into the desert with a liter of water, when do you have to turn back? When you're halfway through the water. My students always say, well, when you're done with the water. And I go, well, then you're dead. So I said, no, when you're halfway through the water, it's called the point of no return. And in other words, once you're past the halfway point, you got to keep going and hope you find water. And that's what Columbus said. He said, I'm going to be the first to sail beyond the point of no return. And I believe that India is just beyond it, because the world is small. It's just beyond it. And that's his big deal. And now, of course, he couldn't tell his sailors really what the gig was, because, and he had to keep a secret as to where the water was, because he was putting all their lives at risk. And Columbus had gone all around Europe trying to find someone to finance this voyage, and most of them listened to their mathematicians. The Greeks had already measured the circumference of the earth, but it was complicated math, and neither Columbus nor Queen Isabella of Spain knew their math. Most kings at the time were illiterate. But they knew if Columbus is right, this is the stuff of empires. And so they financed his voyage, and he set off. And of course, the rest is history. Well, much of the history has been widely suppressed. He brought back after his first voyage, he said, I made it to India, and he called the people Indians, and which is the mistake we continue to use when we refer to Native Americans. And he brought back some feathers and some Native Americans, and Queen Elizabeth said, where's the money? I don't care about your Indians. Where are the silks and spices? And he said, I didn't find any silks and spices, but I found a little gold. And he said, well, head on back. And he had to produce the gold. I mean, he was desperate, and he was on the island Hispaniola, and if the worst accusations are true, he began to, pretty much murder the Native Americans. He gave them a quota of gold, and if they came back after a month without it, he chopped off their arms, and they would stumble away and bleed to death. And the natives of Hispaniola began to commit not only infanticide, but suicide, and almost all the native population of Hispaniola was wiped out. And of course, it didn't end with Hispaniola, because Columbus and the Spaniards brought with them disease. Worst of all, smallpox and measles and so on. And it just spread like wildfire through the continent, leading to the greatest racial genocide in human history. Just in North America, I think when Columbus arrived, they estimate there were about 20 million Native Americans, and just a few years later, 50 years or whatever it was, there was only 1 million left. Over 90% would perish. And yes, some of that was due to Spanish cruelty and English cruelty, but most of it was just due to disease, which for me as a former Catholic, that's a hard pill to swallow, in the idea of a benevolent God. But this was going to happen no matter who came. You can't pin that all on Columbus. But no matter what you say, Columbus, for better and for worse, remains one of the most consequential people in human history. He united two continents. Now I get to one of my favorite persons here who will feature much very closely in the conquest, and that is Malinche. How many have heard of Malinche? Now you have to say it two ways. Everyone say it first way, Malinche. And then say it the way many Mexicans say it, Malinche. How many of that sounds like an insult? And it is. She goes down in history, I think, not rightfully so, as the Benedict Arnold of her people and her race. She was a princess, but was sold into slavery, perhaps by her mother. And when Cortés advanced towards Tenochtitlan, one of the tribes that agreed to come in alliance with him gave their captive, Malinche, to him as a gift. And many of the natives joined him, but of course, because the Aztecs practiced this awful human sacrifice, they started whole wars, the sole purpose of which was to gather thousands of sacrificial people who would be sacrificed on their mighty altars. And so you can imagine there was a lot of hatred towards the Aztecs, and which is why native tribes aligned with Cortés to defeat them. And Cortés was the quintessential conquistador. He was brave, strong, arrogant, and he must have been a great judge of character, because he immediately recognized the greatness in Malinche, and he made her not only his mistress, but in some ways his chief advisor, and she became his interpreter that helped him to forge these alliances on his way to Tenochtitlan. And after it was all said and done, Cortés said of her, his success, he said, God was first, and after him, Malinche. Malinche made it all possible. And well, now, of course, you and I know that getting rid of the Aztecs was not necessarily a good thing for the Native Americans, because what followed was horrific for the Native Americans. And Cortés instituted what was called the encomienda system, which was just a fancy word for feudalism. And so the Spaniards would come and they would be given a plot of land, and they owned everything on the land, including the Native Americans. And just so you ended up with a feudal society here. And so anyways, the Native Americans didn't know that, and Malinche didn't know what would happen. But nonetheless, she's gone down in history. She's the one. She betrayed her people, which I don't think so. And there's one, his name is Farah Mohammed, I think summarized Malinche best. And this is a quote. It says, "What all the stories of Malinche's life, both damning and sympathetic, ultimately reveal is a particularly intelligent and resourceful woman, betrayed, enslaved, buffeted between two empires, somehow emerging as a historical giant in her own right." Spielberg needs to make a mini-series. Can you imagine? It's got everything: love, sex, betrayal, violence. I don't know why they haven't. Perhaps because Malinche is so controversial. But One day they'll make it, and can you imagine? They think, who will play Malinche? Madonna? You know. Anyways, how am I doing? This didn't turn on. How am I doing? 10 minutes. Oh, I'm not going to get even a third of the way through, but oh well. How many have heard of Cuauhtemoc? He's another one, Native American whom you should know. After Montezuma was killed, he inherited the throne at 25 years old of the Aztecs. And so at 25 years old, had to try to defend the Aztecs and forge these alliances. Man, 25 years old, what bad luck to inherit it at that time. And he did his best. He fought, sort of like the cadets. He fought tenaciously, courageously, and ultimately futilely. And according to legend, this is what he said after his capture. He said, "Ah, Captain," meaning Cortez, "I've already done all in my power to defend my kingdom and free it from your hands. And because my fortune has not been favorable, take my life, which will be very just, and with this will end the Mexican kingdom." And Cortez claimed that he replied, "You have defended your capital like a brave warrior. A Spaniard knows how to respect valor, even in an enemy." If it isn't true, it ought to be. But Cortez did not fulfill his word. He took him aside. He said, "Where's the gold?" And when Cuauhtemoc didn't tell him, he put it literally, that's the way they tortured, they put his feet to the fire, and ultimately he executed Cuauhtemoc. But if you go to in Mexico City, they've got a huge statue to him, which is a wonderful symbol, I think, of just Mexico. Just, you know, this, you know, so many times this amazing courage, ultimately futile. And so he's a wonderful symbol. But not to paint all the Spaniards as villains. How many have heard of a priest named De las Casas, who came along with the conquerors, and he came when he was 18 years old, received an encomienda. He was going to be wealthy. He participated in the invasion of Cuba. But then he wrote afterwards, "I saw here cruelty on a scale no living being has ever seen or expects to see." And he was sort of like Saul on the road to Damascus. He just said, "I can't be a part of this." And he spent the rest of his life fighting to end the encomienda system and trying to defend them. And locally, no one would listen to him. There's too much money to be made. So he took it to the king, and the king appointed him defender of the Indians. And briefly, the king, you know, did away with the encomienda system. He got the Pope to admit that maybe these natives were human beings. He was declared a bishop of San Cristobal, which is where we get San Cristobal de las Casas. He was the first bishop. And he was ruthless. He said any of these wealthy Spaniards, if they mistreated their natives, treated them like slaves, he excommunicated them. But it didn't work, of course. There was too much money to be made. There was another one named Vasco de Quiroga, another fellow who came over here in his 60s, at a time when you and I are thinking, okay, I'm done. Time to sort of ease my way into retirement. He was only beginning. And like De las Casas, he was horrified by what he saw. And he was in Michoacan, just to the south of the lake here. And there was a brutal conquistador, Nuno Beltrán de Guzmán, who was just annihilating Native Americans, exploiting them. It was raping them. And Quiroga got him put on trial and sent back to Spain in chains. And he had led Thomas More. You know that new school they're opening up, Thomas More? Thomas More wrote Utopia. And he said, we're going to do it. This is the new world. We're going to create utopia here on earth. And he created all these lovely Native American republics here in Mexico, in Michoacan. And each of the different villages specialized in one form of artisanry, which continues to today.
And so if you go to Michoacan, many of the different villages specialize, and that's all because of him. He lived to his 90s, and the natives called him Tato Vasco, just this tremendous term of endearment. And there's a university named after him, a city and many streets in Michoacan. Amazing human being. I'm glad I have time to talk about this one. Another herstory story. How many have heard of Juana Inés de la Cruz? They just, I forget which, they're going to put her on yet more money because she is big. She was probably, she was the greatest American intellect, the greatest intellect on the continent in the 17th century. She could read and write at the age of 3. She wanted to go to school, but girls didn't go to school. So she begged her parents, dress me up as a boy, let me go to school. They wouldn't. So eventually she became a lady-in-waiting in the Viceroy's court. The Viceroy was sort of the king here in Spain, in New Spain, and represented the King of Spain. So sort of the big guy here. And she was a lady-in-waiting there, and waiting to get married. But the Viceroy realized there's something really special about Juana Inés de la Cruz. He had never met anyone so intelligent. So he convened a panel of, I think it was, I didn't put it here, 40 of the best mathematicians, theologians, philosophers, put them in a circle, a semicircle, and put her in the center and said, have at it. Quiz her. They were dumbfounded. They couldn't stump her on any subject. She was that smart. And sort of like Susan B. Anthony, she said, I know I'm a lady in waiting and I can marry someone, but then I'm going to be a slave. She became a nun, because then I could continue to learn and continue to study. And her library became the largest library on the continent. And it became a salon where people from all over the continent came to discuss all the works of the day. And she got herself into trouble because she challenged Catholic teaching and she challenged male supremacy. She goes down in history as sort of a proto-feminist, which means she was a feminist before we even had the word for it. And fortunately, let me just read some of the things she wrote. She said, who has forbidden women to engage in private and individual studies? Have they not a rational soul as men do? I have this inclination to study, and if it is evil, I am not the one who formed me thus. I was born with it, and with it I shall die. And then she wrote, foolish men who accuse women mindlessly, you cannot see you cause what you abuse. Fortunately for her, she had a defender for many years. Let me think, I look at what it was. The Marquis and Marquess de la Laguna. Very wealthy, very powerful people who just loved her. And so every time she got into trouble, they would step in and defend her. Oh my. Eventually they went back to Spain and left her defenseless. And then the church stepped in and silenced her and took away her library and said, you will spend the rest of your life in penance. And she died helping others during a plague. So if you're looking for a hero, Juana Inés de la Cruz. And by the way, they made a marvelous series called Juana Inés. It's in Spanish with English subtitles. It's phenomenal. By the way, there's one other reason that I admire her personally, and maybe the reason why she didn't want to get married. There's a lot of evidence that she was also lesbian. She had a very intimate relationship with the Marquesa. And that, by the way, the Spanish series is very upfront about that. And she was an amazing poet, and I'll just read some of her love poetry that she wrote to the Marquesa. She said, that you're a woman far away is no hindrance to my love. For the soul, as you know, distance and sex don't count. And then later, let my love be ever doomed, if guilty in its intent. For loving you is a crime of which I will never repent. An amazing, amazing woman. So I've only got like 3 or 4 more minutes, right? I was hoping to get through the entire Mexican War for Independence, because all the streets, Morelos and next time. But I do want to tell you, I guess I'll end with very quickly sort of the tragedy of the Mexican War for Independence. And begin with, very briefly, just American exceptionalism. And with a caveat, when I use that word, I'm not talking the way it's so often used today. The United States of America is exceptional in many ways today. We have the largest economy on earth with China nipping at our heels, but almost every other way in which we're number one are embarrassing things. We're the only country without health care. We're number one in diabetes, childhood poverty, health, just you name it, all the ways in which we're number one. Most incarcerated, most money sent on defense. So when I use American exceptionalism, it's not the way it's used today. It's with the 13 original colonies. When I studied the Mexican War for Independence, it made me appreciate, this is the thing about studying and travel, you leave your home in order to find it. The 13 colonies were uniquely situated to become the first experiment of a democratic republic since sort of the fall of the Roman Empire. And we had a lot of things going for us that virtually no other place did. And it's a morality tale today as we supposedly go around the world just installing democracy in places that are clearly not ready for it. I mean, first of all, the Pilgrims were born, thousands of miles off course, which meant they weren't landing where they had a charter. And so before they got off their boat, they said, we got nothing. So they came up with the Mayflower Compact, the rules and the agreements. Right from the very beginning, we Americans were designing our own governments. And even many years later, the British practiced what was called salutary neglect, or beneficial neglect. It was working for both sides, the mother country and the colonies, so they just let the colonists do whatever the heck they wanted. And it was only after the French and Indian War and England is broke that they began to say, all right, we're stepping in here, and I'll know how that ended. But we were used to governing ourselves. The second thing is we were used to, the Spaniards enslaved the natives and created sort of a feudalism. And feudalism doesn't work economically, as you know. The Americans just pushed the natives out, and so they weren't ever assimilated. And as a result, we didn't have this massive underclass. Capitalism worked, and we ended up with one of the strongest middle classes on the planet. Very important to democracy, which is frightening with the middle class being destroyed systematically in the United States today. We also had sort of just a very clear goal of what we were fighting for, thanks to Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence. All the people fighting knew we are going to get rid of not only our colonial masters, but we were getting rid of monarchy. We will establish a republic. It was a very clear goal, which the Mexicans did not have, as I'll probably end with that. They also had a respect for differences. The biggest difference that we had, even though we agreed on a republic, we couldn't agree on states' rights versus federal. Are we going to have a strong central government or not? And this was the big argument for the next century in the United States. But we had a century where we didn't kill each other over it until the Civil War. That's when it finally came to a head. But we had 100 years of peace, which allowed us to build and grow in strength and wealth and so on, and establish democratic roots. The Mexicans never stopped fighting each other. And we were, really, really lucky about that. I'll end just with this. It's sort of an introduction to the Mexican War for Independence, not to be confused with the Mexican Revolution that was against Porfirio Diaz. All the different people who fought, Morelos, Guerrero, Hidalgo, the only thing they could agree on is that Mexico would remain a Catholic country. That's it. And that alone, the no separation of church and state, did not bode well for the future of Mexico. At one time, the Catholic Church owned most of the land in the country. It was just immensely powerful, and that wasn't healthy for Mexico. And then you had to fight to try to dethrone the Catholic Church, more violence. Some people, when they just wanted to replace the local government. Other people said, no, we want to replace the Spanish king with a local king. Other people said, no, we want to establish a republic, but we don't want to futz with any of the social inequalities. And other people said, no, we're going to, and they didn't agree. And so from the very beginning, the Mexicans weren't even in agreement about what they were fighting for. And so then when they were done and they finally established freedom, they still didn't know what kind of government they had. And so initially they went with monarchy and Iturbide, but then the Republicans immediately overthrew him, and then that established a precedent that this is the way we're going to solve our problems here in Mexico. And this goes all the way back to Spain, that had solved their problems with civil war forever. And another thing is Spain has, they have, their heritage is not democracy, it's caudillos, one-man rule. It's the king or the viceroy or Cortez or Montezuma. These are horrible precedents that set Mexico up really badly. And Guadalupe Victoria, I wanted to end with him. Fascinating story of redemption. But he was the first president of Mexico and the only one for the next 30 years who finished his term. And so if you want to know why Mexico, with perhaps even greater resources than the United States, why isn't it a first world nation? Well, there's our morality tale here. They spent most of their time fighting each other. What a shame. Thank you.